July 18, 1966. 5 p.m. Hollywood, California. The sun has been beating on the parking lot outside North Sycamore Avenue for 9 hours. The asphalt is radiating heat. The air smells like exhaust and bougainvillea. Eva Lorraine Fuller steps outside to collect the mail. She is a practical Texas woman who followed her sons to Los Angeles because that is what mothers do. She walks past an Oldsmobile parked in the vacant lot next to the apartment building. It is her car. Her son Bobby borrowed it the night before. She looks through the driver's side window. The glass is up. All 4 windows are sealed. The doors are shut, not locked. And inside, slumped face down across the front seat, is a 23-year-old man in clothes she does not recognize as the outfit he left the house wearing. She calls his name. He does not move. She opens the door. The smell hits her first, not decay. Gasoline, raw, industrial, choking petroleum vapor billowing out of the sealed cabin like opening the cap on a fuel drum. Her son's hair is wet with it. His skin is discolored. His clothes are soaked through. A 2.5-gallon gas can sits on the seat beside him, 1/3 full, with a rubber siphoning hose draped across his body. His right index finger is bent backward at an angle fingers do not bend. His body is stiff. Full rigor mortis. He has been gone for hours. The Los Angeles Police Department arrives. They look at the gas can. They look at the hose. They look at a young man in a car full of gasoline fumes, and within hours, they check a box on the report. Self-inflicted. Case closed. No investigation follows. One officer picks up the gasoline can, the single most important piece of physical evidence at the site, and throws it into a dumpster. When Bob Keane, Fuller's record label owner, asks why he is destroying evidence, the officer replies, "He's just a rock and roll punk." 2 days earlier, the LAPD's chief of police, William H. Parker, had collapsed and died. The head of the city's homicide division had been pulled from his post to replace him. The department was headless, distracted, and looking for cases it could close fast. Bobby Fuller's body, reeking of gasoline in a Hollywood parking lot, was not a mystery they wanted to solve. It was a box they wanted to check. They checked it. Robert Gaston Fuller was buried 4 days later at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills. The headstone reads, "Beloved Son." There is no mention of the music. There is no mention of the gasoline. And for 60 years, the question has never been answered. Who poured 2.5 gallons of fuel on a 23-year-old guitar player who had no drugs in his system, no alcohol in his blood, no history of depression, and a career that was 6 months old and climbing? Bobby Fuller was not born into the music industry. He was born into the oil industry. Baytown, Texas. October 22, 1942. His father, Lawson, worked the refineries. The family drifted, Baytown to Salt Lake City back to Texas, following the pipeline of blue-collar work until they settled in El Paso in 1956. El Paso in 1956 was a border town with a jukebox problem. The radio was bleeding rock and roll across the desert from every direction. Elvis Presley was detonating on national television. And 300 miles northeast, in the flat, dusty town of Clovis, New Mexico, a skinny kid in thick glasses named Buddy Holly was walking into Norman Petty's studio to record "That'll Be the Day." Bobby Fuller heard that record and made a decision that would define his life and, in a grotesque irony, mirror his death. He would become Buddy Holly's heir. He was 14. He taught himself guitar. He recruited his younger brother Randy on bass. He formed bands with names that changed every few months: the Embers, the Fanatics, Captain Fuller, and the Rocket Squad. The names were disposable. The ambition was not. By the early 1960s, Fuller had done something that almost no teenager in El Paso had ever attempted. He built a recording studio in his parents' house. He bought a mixing board from a local radio station. He strung microphones through the hallways. He constructed a primitive echo chamber in the backyard using concrete and salvaged materials. The recordings he produced in that garage were so clean, so professional, that other local bands started showing up and asking to use his equipment. He was not waiting for the industry to discover him. He was building his own infrastructure. He was 17 years old, and he was already thinking like a producer. He made the pilgrimage. He and Randy loaded their gear into a car and drove 300 miles northeast from El Paso to Clovis, across the desert and the flat scrubland of southern New Mexico, to 1313 West 7th Street, to the Norman Petty studio where Buddy Holly had cut his masterpieces. They recorded 2 tracks, You're in Love and Guess We'll Fall in Love, for Yucca Records out of Alamogordo. The song sounded like Cricket's B-sides, and Bobby knew it. He was still learning the language. But he stood in the same room where Peggy Sue was born. He touched the same console. He breathed the same dust. He absorbed the Clovis sound, that clean, reverb-heavy West Texas snap, and carried it back to El Paso like stolen fire. Back home, he kept building. The garage studio was getting better. He bought equipment piece by piece, upgrading the microphones, adding a second tape deck. The recordings he was pulling out of that house were clean enough to fool professional engineers. Other El Paso bands started booking time in Bobby's living room. He was running a label, a studio, and a venue before he turned 21. He opened an all-ages club called the Teen Rendezvous, bankrolled by his parents. He played it 5 nights a week, testing new material on teenagers who didn't know they were watching a future chart act. He released singles on his own label, Exeter Records, pressing the vinyl himself, driving copies to local radio stations. One of those singles was a cover of a song written by Sonny Curtis, the guitarist who had replaced Buddy Holly in the Crickets after Holly's death. The song was called I Fought the Law. That original El Paso recording was raw, regional. It played on KELP and nowhere else. Nobody outside the Texas-New Mexico border heard it, but Bobby held on to the song. He knew it was a weapon. He was waiting for the right moment to fire it. In late 1964, the Teen Rendezvous burned down. Bobby Fuller looked at the ashes and decided there was nothing left for him in El Paso. He packed the band into a car and drove west to Los Angeles. He walked into the office of Bob Keane. Keane ran Delphi Records from a small operation in Hollywood. His track record was impressive and disturbing in equal measure. He had discovered Ritchie Valens in 1958, signed the 17-year-old to Delphi, produced La Bamba and Donna, and watched his star client board a Beechcraft Bonanza in Iowa and die in a frozen cornfield 6 months later. He had also been involved with Sam Cooke during Cooke's early career, signing him to Keane Records before a business partner forced Keane out of his own company. 2 artists signed to his labels, one gone in a plane crash at 17, the other shot in a motel under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. And now Bob Keane was looking at a 22-year-old kid from El Paso who sounded like the lost voice from Lubbock. He signed Bobby Fuller to his subsidiary label, Mustang Records. The Bobby Fuller Four, Bobby on vocals and lead guitar, Randy on bass, Jim Reese on rhythm guitar, Dwayne Quirico on drums, started playing PJ's, a West Hollywood nightclub that was the social hub of the mid-60s music scene. Mia Farrow, Go-Go, danced there before she met Sinatra. Phil Spector sat in on keyboards with the band. Casey Kasem, the KRLA disc jockey, booked them for his dances and championed them on the radio. PJ's was also a club with connections to organized crime. The ownership had ties to figures in the Los Angeles underworld. The musicians who played there were paid well and asked no questions. Bobby Fuller, the kid from El Paso who built echo chambers in his backyard, was suddenly performing in a room where the men in the back booths did not clap. In December 1965, Keane released the Bobby Fuller 4's re-recorded version of I Fought the Law. By March 1966, it hit number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100. George Harrison, in an interview, named the Bobby Fuller 4 as the group he listened to most. The follow-up single, a cover of Buddy Holly's Love's Made a Fool of You, cracked the top 30. Bobby Fuller had arrived. He was 23. He had a top 10 hit in America. He was carrying the torch of the man whose studio he had recorded in as a teenager. And then, within weeks, the gears turned against him. Bobby wanted to control his records. Keane wanted to control Bobby. The disagreements were specific and escalating. Keane was adding string sections and vocal overdubs to Bobby's tracks without consulting him. The same kind of studio manipulation that Norman Petty had used on Buddy Holly a decade earlier. When Keane pushed a new single called The Magic Touch, a soul-inflected track written by a songwriter affiliated with Roulette Records in New York, Bobby fought it. It did not sound like the Bobby Fuller 4. It sounded like a product engineered by a man who was thinking about distribution quotas, not music. Bobby's objections were overruled. The single was recorded and released anyway. He was the name on the label, but he was not the hand on the wheel. Bobby had started talking to Phil Spector, who loved the band and had sat in with them at PJ's. Spector wanted to produce him. Bobby was flattered but wary. Spector's wall of sound was the opposite of his stripped-down Clovis aesthetic. He did not want to trade one controlling producer for another. What Bobby wanted was the thing he had already built once before: independence. He told the band he was going solo. He told Keane he was leaving Delphi. He talked about going back to Texas, rebuilding the studio, pressing his own records again. He had done it at 17 with a borrowed mixing board. He could do it at 23 with a hit single on his resume. He was not asking permission. He was announcing a departure. The official autopsy was performed by Los Angeles Deputy Medical Examiner Jerry Nelson. His report is the foundation of everything that followed, and the foundation has cracks running through it. Nelson's findings, according to journalist Dean Kuipers, stated that Bobby's face, chest, and side were covered in petechial hemorrhages, tiny burst blood vessels in the skin. Nelson attributed these to the chemical reaction between gasoline vapors and the extreme heat inside the sealed car under the July sun. He found no bruises, no broken bones, no cuts. His official conclusion: death by asphyxiation due to inhalation of gasoline. On the death certificate, 2 boxes were checked: accident and self-inflicted. Next to both boxes, someone, Nelson, a clerk, a supervisor, had written question marks. The man who conducted the autopsy could not decide how this man died. He wrote question marks next to his own verdict and signed the report. The physical evidence at the scene told a different story from the paperwork. Bobby Fuller's body was in full rigor mortis when his mother found him at 5 p.m. Rigor mortis, in the July heat of a sealed car saturated with gasoline fumes, would have been accelerated. But even under accelerated conditions, the body had been lifeless for a minimum of several hours. His mother had checked for the car earlier in the day. It was not there. Sometime between her earlier check and 5 p.m., the Oldsmobile appeared in the parking lot with Bobby Fuller inside it. A body in rigor mortis does not drive itself home. Bobby's bandmate, Dwayne Quirico, stated it plainly. The car was not in the lot when Mrs. Fuller checked earlier, and half an hour later, there it was with Bobby's body inside. The timeline does not accommodate a man who drove himself to that spot and died there. His bladder was full, a detail buried in the medical notes. A full bladder indicates prolonged unconsciousness before death, the body's final functions continuing while the mind was already gone. Bobby Fuller did not sit in a car and voluntarily inhale gasoline while conscious. He was incapacitated before the fuel ever entered his lungs. Witnesses at the scene reported what they saw before the LAPD contaminated the evidence. Bruising on his chest and shoulders, dried blood around his chin and mouth, and a right index finger bent backward far enough to appear broken. These observations are at odds with Nelson's autopsy finding of no bruises, no broken bones. Either the witnesses were wrong, or the autopsy was incomplete. The petechial hemorrhages Nelson documented could mask blunt force trauma on discolored, gasoline-burned skin, especially if the examiner was not looking for it. No toxicology report showed drugs, no alcohol. Bobby Fuller was, by every account from those who knew him, a clean-living musician. His road manager, Rick Stone, said 2 beers were too much for him. Drummer Dalton Powell confirmed he did not use drugs. He got his high from the studio. And then there is the investigation itself. The gasoline can, the single most critical piece of physical evidence, was thrown into a garbage bin by an LAPD officer at the scene. Not bagged, not tagged, not sent to the lab for fingerprint analysis. Discarded in front of a witness, with contempt. The car was never dusted for prints. No crime scene photographs entered the official record. The rubber siphoning hose was not tested for trace DNA, a technology that did not yet exist, but the hose itself was not preserved for future analysis either. The LAPD did not investigate Bobby Fuller's death. They processed it. They treated it like paperwork, not like a crime scene, and they had a reason. On July 16, 1966, 2 days before Bobby Fuller's body was discovered, LAPD Chief William H. Parker collapsed and died of a heart attack at a banquet. Parker had run the department for 16 years. His death threw the LAPD into administrative chaos. The head of the homicide division was tapped to fill the vacuum. Detectives were reassigned. Chains of command were disrupted. When Bobby Fuller's case landed on a desk 48 hours later, the department was functionally decapitated. A young musician in a gasoline-filled car? Self-inflicted. Close the file, move on. They moved on. But the question behind the question remains. Who had motive? Bobby Fuller's announced departure from Delphi was not just a contract dispute. It threatened a revenue stream that ran far above Bob Keane's pay grade. Just weeks before Bobby died, Keane had signed an exclusive distribution deal with Roulette Records in New York. Roulette was owned by Morris Levy. Morris Levy was not a record executive. He was a racketeer who happened to own a record label. He had been connected to the Genovese crime family for decades. He had co-founded the Birdland Jazz Club in New York in the late 1940s, and from that base, he had built a music empire that ran on intimidation, forged contracts, and stolen publishing credits. He controlled the publishing rights of dozens of artists through coercion and fraud. Frankie Lyman, the teenage singer who hit #1 with Why Do Fools Fall in Love, watched Levy claim ownership of his songs and his royalties. Levy would later be convicted of extortion in 1988, sentenced to 10 years, and die of cancer before serving a day. In the mid-1960s, His label had a simple business model: sign artists, control their publishing, and collect. Roulette's distribution deals were not handshake agreements. They were arrangements backed by men who did not file lawsuits to settle disputes. Bobby Fuller had no idea who Morris Levy was. He was a kid from El Paso who wanted to play guitar. He did not read the fine print on Bob Keane's distribution agreements. He did not know that when Keane signed the Roulette deal, Bobby Fuller's recordings became assets in a pipeline that ended at Morris Levy's desk. If Bobby walked away from Delphi, he was not just leaving a small Hollywood label. He was pulling product out of a supply chain that had organized crime at the top. Rumors persisted for nearly 50 years that Keane and his business partner, Larry Nunes, held a large life insurance policy on Bobby Fuller. Some accounts put the figure at $800,000. This has never been conclusively verified. No evidence of a payout ever surfaced, but the rumor circulated among band members and industry insiders for years after Bobby's death. Randy Fuller, Bobby's brother, was direct about the environment. In interviews, he described the world the band had entered. You get in a hurry to make it and want to make it so bad that you sign yourself away and you end up having dealings with the mob. You don't really want to go there, but you're already there. They were already there. PJ's nightclub, the men in the booths, the distribution deal, the artist who wanted out. Bobby Fuller did not have the flu. He did not have a gambling debt. He did not have a drug problem. He had a contract, and he wanted to break it. The night of July 17th, 1966, Bobby Fuller was at home at the Sycamore Avenue apartment. He had spent the day with friends. The band had a meeting pending at Bob Keane's office to discuss the future of the group. Tensions were high. Bobby had made it clear he was done. Sometime between 1 and 3 a.m. on the morning of July 18th, the telephone rang. Bobby took the call. His brother Randy later recalled that Bobby was still in his lounging clothes when he left, a detail that mattered. Bobby Fuller was very detailed about his appearance. He styled his hair. He wore sharp clothes. He would not have walked out of the apartment in house clothes unless he was going somewhere close, informal, or somewhere he was summoned to in a hurry. He took his mother's Oldsmobile. He did not say where he was going. He did not say who called. Between 3 a.m. and 5 p.m. on July 18th, a window of 14 hours, Bobby Fuller vanished from the record. No confirmed sighting, no phone call. No witness has ever come forward to place him at a specific location during those hours. There is a void in the timeline, and the void is where the crime lives. His mother checked the parking lot during the day. The car was not there. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the Oldsmobile reappeared in the vacant lot, with Bobby inside it. The scene that his mother found is the one we opened with. The gasoline, the hose, the stiff body, the bent finger, the sealed windows. None of it had been there an hour earlier. Someone had driven Bobby Fuller home after he was already gone, staged the car to look like a self-inflicted act, and walked away in broad daylight in a residential Hollywood neighborhood. The official ruling collapses under every angle of examination. The method itself is medically absurd. Multiple physicians have stated on record that it is physically impossible to voluntarily swallow enough gasoline to kill yourself. The human gag reflex rejects petroleum with violent force. The burning sensation in the throat and esophagus triggers an immediate involuntary rejection. You would vomit before you could ingest a lethal quantity. If Bobby Fuller was conscious and in control of his own body, gasoline ingestion was not an option. The coroner's report states he died from inhaling the fumes, not from swallowing. But even this scenario, voluntary gasoline inhalation in a sealed car, raises questions that the LAPD never asked. If Bobby sealed himself inside a car to die by fume inhalation, why was his finger broken? Why was there dried blood around his chin and mouth? Why were his clothes not the ones he had been wearing when he left the apartment? And why was the car absent from the parking lot for hours before reappearing with a body inside? Each question, by itself, is troubling. Together, they describe a scene that was arranged, not one that occurred naturally. This was not a self-inflicted act that looked suspicious. It was foul play that someone spent about 15 minutes trying to disguise as something else. The Bobby Fuller Four never played another show. Jim Reese, the rhythm guitarist, was drafted to Vietnam within weeks. Randy Fuller drove the Oldsmobile, the gasoline fumes still soaked into the upholstery, the biological residue still present on the seat, from Los Angeles back to El Paso. Through New Mexico, in 111-degree heat, with the windows down, trying to air out the car that had been his brother's coffin. The band meeting at Bob Keane's office, the one Bobby was supposed to attend on July 18th, went ahead without him. The agenda item, what to do about Bobby's desire to leave, was no longer relevant. In the years after Bobby Fuller's death, the official classification was quietly changed. The self-inflicted finding was removed. The cause of death now reads, accident. Accidental asphyxiation due to inhalation of gasoline. The question marks remain on the original form. No one has ever explained them. No one has ever reopened the investigation. No additional forensic analysis has been conducted on any surviving evidence, because there is no surviving evidence. Consider the symmetry. Bobby Fuller worshipped Buddy Holly. He drove to Clovis, New Mexico, to record in the same studio. He covered Buddy Holly's songs. His biggest hit, I Fought the Law, was written by Sonny Curtis. His follow-up single was a Buddy Holly composition. He signed to a label run by the man who had discovered Ritchie Valens, another passenger on that same Beechcraft Bonanza in 1959. Bobby Fuller built his entire career in the sonic shadow of a ghost, and then he died under the management of a man who had already lost 2 clients to violent early deaths. Valens to a plane crash, Cook to a bullet in a motel room. 3 artists, 1 label boss. None of them made it to 34. 2 of those deaths have never been adequately investigated. Eric Green, a relative of Sam Cooke, drew the connection publicly. Both Cooke and Fuller were last seen alive at PJ's. Both were signed to labels owned by Bob Keane. Both died in circumstances where the physical evidence contradicted the official ruling. Both cases were closed before they were investigated. Is Bob Keane responsible? There is no evidence of that. He was never charged. He was never a suspect. He expressed grief and confusion publicly. But Bob Keane was a man who operated in a specific ecosystem. He took money from men who solved problems with violence. He signed distribution deals with labels run by convicted racketeers. He placed young, naive musicians from small towns into a machine that chewed through talent and catalogs with equal indifference. Whether Keane pulled a trigger or poured a gallon of fuel is beside the point. He built the room where the crime became possible. Bobby Fuller died because he wanted to leave that room. He had been a professional recording artist for 18 months. He had 1 top 10 hit and the talent to produce 100 more. He could write, he could produce. He could build a studio from junkyard parts and make it sound like Abbey Road. In El Paso, he had been the architect of his own career, writing songs, pressing records, booking venues, engineering sessions. In Los Angeles, he became a product in someone else's catalog. The moment he tried to reclaim what he had built, The machinery that owned him intervened. The song that made him famous was about a man who challenged authority and lost. I fought the law, and the law won. Sonny Curtis wrote it as fiction. Bobby Fuller performed it as prophecy. In 2017, Chuck Prophet released an album called Bobby Fuller Died for Your Sins. Lou Reed referenced Fuller by name on the track Dirt from the 1978 album Street Hassle. The Clash turned I Fought the Law into a punk anthem a decade after Bobby's death, after hearing the original on a jukebox in San Francisco. None of them knew the man. All of them understood the ghost. The gasoline has long since evaporated from the upholstery of that Oldsmobile. The parking lot on North Sycamore is still there. The question marks on the autopsy form are still there. And the case, 60 years cold, with no evidence, no witnesses, and no suspects, is still officially an accident. It was not an accident. It was not self-inflicted. It was a crime dressed in a gas can and a rubber hose, committed in a 14-hour window that nobody has ever accounted for, processed by a police department that had lost its chief 2 days earlier, and buried under a headstone that says "Beloved Son" and nothing else. Bobby Fuller fought the law. The law didn't even show up. The cruelest detail is the one that connects the beginning to the end. In El Paso, Bobby Fuller had everything he needed: a studio, a stage, a loyal audience, creative control, and independence. He left because the industry told him he needed Los Angeles to be real. He signed with a label because distribution was supposed to be the price of legitimacy. And he played the mob-connected clubs because that was how you got on the radio in 1965. Every step toward legitimacy was a step away from the self-sufficiency he had built in that garage. Every handshake in Hollywood compromised the autonomy he had earned in the desert. He traded the echo chamber he built in his backyard for a recording studio, controlled by men who answered to Morris Levy. Buddy Holly died because Norman Petty froze his royalties and forced him onto a freezing bus. Bobby Fuller died because Bob Keane tied his recordings to a distribution chain owned by the mob, and Bobby tried to walk away from the table. The mechanism is identical. A young musician from Texas, a controlling figure who holds the money, a contract that becomes a cage, an exit attempt that triggers the final sequence. Holly's death was weather and disorientation, an accident with a cause. Fuller's death was gasoline and silence, a crime with no investigation. Both men built their sound in the same corner of the same desert. Both recorded in Norman Petty's studio. Both died before they turned 24. And both deaths were treated as closed cases before anyone asked the right questions. If you want to keep pulling apart the cases the industry closed too fast, the crashes they never explained, and the contracts that killed the people who signed them, subscribe. We do not tell you the story of the song. We investigate the silence that followed it.